The question I get asked most frequently in the early appointments in my grief therapy practice is, am I losing my mind? Well, it's pretty clear that when you're grieving, you already feel as though you have a broken heart. But what we're going to explore today is how you actually have a broken brain for a period of time, and how that impacts why and how you might go about doing your grief work. It's so important to explore the physicality of the grief symptoms before we talk about doing the hard work of the emotional work of your love and loss. If you are curious about grief and how it impacts you, how it affects your ability to live and love, then please subscribe to this channel. We're going to explore all sources of grief and all ways to respond to it. So welcome to my channel, Grief Support That Works. My name is Jo McRogers, and I'm a psychotherapist that has supported grief for many, many years. And today we're going to talk about meeting your grief symptoms that show up physically so that you can begin to antidote them before I can even ask you to do the emotional work of your grief. So today we're going to talk about regions of the brain and how they help or hinder our response to our grief. We'll talk then what that means for you emotionally. And finally, at the end, we will talk about tips that you can use in order to antidote some of the physical symptoms of your grief in order to get to the emotional work. So let's get to it. So first we're going to talk about the parasympathetic system. Our parasympathetic system is responsible for some very basic needs: breathing, sleeping, eating, thirst. However, when we're grieving, a lot of those cues get interfered with. When you think about loss, often the sharp intake of breath, when you learn of the death of somebody, it's almost like that sets the limit of your breath. So when we are grieving, our breath often becomes short and shallow. When we are grieving, we lose our hunger and thirst cues. And when we are grieving, we often have interrupted sleep. We're either sleeping too much or not sleeping at all. And this is the responsibility of the parasympathetic system, and it can really interfere with how resilient you feel in meeting your grief. Next, we're going to talk about our prefrontal lobes, our prefrontal cortex. These are the places in our brain that are responsible for our executive functioning, our ability to make decisions, our focus, our concentration, our search for meaning. You can imagine then, if all of those are hijacked by grief, how do you grieve while being unable to make decisions that you would normally be able to make in a snap? How do you look for meaning when you're grieving and it feels like there's no meaning to the world? How do you begin to make decisions and trust yourself that they're sound decisions? The prefrontal cortex plays a lot of roles in all of this executive decision making. So next we're going to speak about the amygdala, which is our reptilian brain. It is designed to protect us from threats. When we are grieving, it is a threat to our safety. It is a threat to our sense of control. You've probably heard of the fight, flight, freeze response. That is our amygdala. And when we are grieving, the risk is that we get caught in one of those response patterns. Our amygdala is there designed to protect us, and it cannot tell the difference between a past threat, a current threat, or a perceived threat. So the amygdala holds a lot of responsibility in how we approach our grief. And the final system that I want to talk about is our limbic system. Our limbic system is responsible for protecting us also. And because it interprets a grieving response as a fearful response, it clicks onto high and it allows us to turn inwards. It makes our grieving experience become very inward focused. It will show up in things like a loss of interest. Things that brought you joy or comfort before no longer interest you. It will show up in having no curiosity about the outside world because you are busy turning inwards in order to protect yourself from the fearful response of grief. So what I'd like to know right now is if any of those sound familiar to you. If any of those seem to be part of your grief experience or someone's grief who you were witnessing, I'm going to ask you to please put a comment below around which one was the most challenging or which grief physical symptom caught you most off guard, so that as a community we can begin to share and we can begin to see just how widespread grief expresses itself physically. So please send your comment below. So let's just review and reflect on what all of these physical grief symptoms can mean for us when we are grieving. I think the early realities that come to people when they're grieving is that grief brings two very harsh lessons. One is that we really don't have the control that we like to believe that we do have. And the other is that grief makes us feel unsafe because it challenges our sense of permanency, it challenges our sense of mortality, ourselves or others, and it changes us. Change not by choice, and that's a very fearful response. So when we look at all of the physicality and their symptoms in grief, how our body expresses and experiences it, you can see why this is just such a harsh setup for trying to do any kind of emotional work. We are on a high fearful alert for threat. We are in a fight, flight, freeze mode, which means our body actually sends the oxygen to our limbs so that we can run away, and that means less oxygen to our brain. Our breath is short and shallow, which again means less oxygen to our brains. It reminds our body of the threat, because if our body doesn't feel like it's being breathed, then it definitely interprets a threat. Our sleep can change. So sleep is so essential to being able to think, to be able to rationalize, to be able to problem solve. And when we're sleeping too much or sleeping not enough, then we are at a huge disadvantage in trying to approach our emotional grief work. If our eating patterns are changed and our thirst patterns are changed, then a body that is undernourished or overnourished with all of the yummy good junk food, or underhydrated, that is not a body that will rest. It is not a body that will think. It is not a body that will problem solve. It is not a body that will emotionally and physically regulate. So those are all the grief symptoms that show up that we end up experiencing emotionally. So our brains are designed to protect us. So know that grief is going to feel very scary. Grief is going to feel very full of fear. And grief is going to feel internal, and it's going to feel isolating. Nobody else is knowing or doing your grief. So it becomes a very personal experience, and that's another reason why grief is so difficult. The children's author C.S. Lewis, who wrote many of my favorite childhood books, Chronicles of Narnia, wrote a book when his partner died, and he called that book A Grief Observed. And the line that stuck out in that book for me most was, "No one told me that grief felt so like fear." I think it's something that catches people off guard when we're talking about grief. We have these beliefs we just need to get through it, stiff upper lip, get it behind you, weep and wail, it'll all end. And that's not necessarily a helpful approach if we're avoiding the fact that grief can feel like fear. So when I was doing a lot of birth work, when I was a birth doula, we had this triangle that we would work on with women in labor that talked about tension, pain, and fear. And I think it's so applicable as well when we're talking about emotional pain as well. So if your body is feeling tense and experiencing all of those physical symptoms, then it is going to increase your sense of what the pain must be like, because you're busy holding yourself away from it. And that again leads to an increase in fear. So think about fear cycles in terms of tension, pain, and fear, and how that plays a role. And what we can do to step into that is to begin to address the physicality of these grief symptoms. So now we've explored the physicality of grief and how all of these challenges influence our grief experience. It's time to look at what can you do about it. So here's my list of things that you can do to try to combat the physical symptoms of grief, keeping in mind that the primary filters I want you to think of using are safety and control. So what can we do? One of the very first things we can do to remind our body, A, that it is safe because we are breathing it, and B, that we have control of it, is obviously breath work. You can Google any search on breath work. You'll find things like belly breathing, square breathing, slow breathing. I want you to take an open mind and experiment with what seems to work for you. Breathing your body is a good response to feeling out of control and feeling unsafe. The next consideration is physically. Physically, how can you begin to get back into your body? There are many ways. Again, if you want to Google how to get grounded, there will be lots of techniques that you can use around getting back into your body. But one of the really easy ones, and you can do it anywhere, no one will even know you're doing it, is to create tension and then to release it. So our shoulders, to pull them up around our ears and tense them, and then lower them and relax. We can do it with our fists. You can do it with your toes in your shoes. No one will even know. But that's also a reminder to your body of where you do have some power, control, and influence, and therefore you are safe. One of the next things that you can think of is visualizing. Some people are visual thinkers, not everybody is. So just experiment with this. Sometimes closing your eyes and going into a place is not healthy when you're grieving, because if you can't control that place, it's going to be fearful. So be careful with this one. But many people will find if they can close their eyes and create a scene in their mind of where they might feel safe, where they might feel relaxed, whether it's a beach, whether it's climbing a mountain, whether it's a stream, whether it's a favorite loved one's house, whether it is whatever you can create that feels safe, a beautiful garden, then know that that might be one of your tools also. The next one I want you to consider is to outsource. If you're not eating and if you have no hunger or thirst, I want you to outsource those prompts. We all have our phones by our sides. Put alarms on it. The other thing that a lot of people do is to put post-it notes so that they can be reminded that every time they walk past the sink that they're gonna make themselves just have a drink of water. Please don't expect yourself to have hunger for a big meal. All those loving, kind people that bring the lasagnas, that's not helpful. I have had too many people tell me that the lasagnas stay in their freezer until they can pitch them. So think of small, little, nutrient-dense snacks. Think of just always taking sips of water to keep your body hydrated and nourished so that you can continue to do your grief work. One of the other things that I lecture about all the time is you really need to be careful about your self-expectations and others' expectations. And we can put that all into one big piece called positive toxicity. All of the sayings about, oh, all things happen for a reason, or time heals all, or heaven needed another angel, those are not necessarily helpful unless those are conclusions that you yourself have come to and they serve you. But to have others suggest to you or to you feel like you need to live up to those beliefs, that is not helpful. So I want you to be very careful about checking your self-expectations. One of the expectations that comes up frequently is getting back to work, getting 3 months behind me, getting 2 weeks behind me. Oh, once I get past the first year, it'll all be okay. Those can be toxic thoughts, and you need to be careful about holding yourself to those kinds of expectations. One of the other things I'm going to suggest when we're talking about being isolated, there's a big difference between being isolated because you're choosing it and isolated because your grief is choosing it for you. So perhaps you'll find one person who knows you, trusts you, that person you can call at 2 a.m. Ask that person to be your check-in person. Ask for them to check in with you regularly and to gently remind you that you are not alone. And for them to please do that with no expectation of a response other than maybe a heart text back or a thumbs up. Thank you for the thoughts today. You don't need to engage in conversation. Just engage in connection. And on the heels of that, the other thing that I want you to do if you're feeling isolated and alone in your grief is to be in charge of all of the other visits, phone calls, texts, so that you aren't exhausted playing grief hostess. That's my term, that's what I call it. Playing grief hostess to all of the others who are trying to support you in your grief or who are trying to process their grief with you. So please ask your person to either field those calls or to know that you do not need to respond. Send out a big text message or a big email in terms of, thank you all for the love and concern. I'm taking some time for myself and I will respond as I am able. so that you don't feel the burden of every text or phone call. This is going to help with that sense of turning inwards and needing to navigate your grief alone. If you are able to set yourself up with some of these tips, then you will likely be able to more physically be ready to do the emotional work of your grief. It will help you not get caught in a paralyzing state of either fight, flight, or freeze. And you will be able to move into your grief, have a relationship with your grief, and move along with your grief. It's not a matter of moving out of it. My basic premise is always that you need to have a relationship with your grief. And in order to do that, you need to address the physicality of these grief symptoms. Please remember that early grief, recent grief, is going to demand all of your attention. And that's okay. What has happened to you is important enough and perhaps is a shock enough that it deserves all of your time and attention in the beginning. And then what I want you to do is to begin to step into your relationship with your grief by addressing these physical symptoms. I've covered a number of things today, and I know there are things that I've missed, and there's likely some wisdom out there amongst all of you viewers. So if there's anything that resonated with you today, please put a comment below in terms of, oh, now I get it, now this makes sense, or I never knew. And if you have anything to offer in terms of what helped you deal with the physicality of grief, please put it below so that, again, we can learn together and have our gathered wisdom. I'd also be so curious to hear if you have a question that I might be able to answer in another video, or if this sparked a question, perhaps I can answer it in the comments below. I would ask you please to share this video with anyone who you think might be helped by it. I am excited for you to be joining in our Grievolution so that we can do grief differently. And know, as always, that my one rule is to do grief with self-compassion. So as always, kind thoughts, kind words, and kind heart. Thank you for joining me today. And so to return to the original question, am I losing my mind? No, you're just grieving.